My name is Nora Brennan. I'm 38 years old. In March, my parents passed away within 7 weeks of each other, and the will left me a crumbling neon motel out on Old Route 66, while my sister Whitney got the 3 luxury apartment buildings in the city. My husband looked at the paperwork, called me useless at our own kitchen table, and told me not to come home until I had taken the good half back from my sister. So I slept on the office cot at the motel. And at 2 in the morning, I noticed something I was not supposed to notice. A freshly oiled panel behind the front desk, and a floor safe my father had been opening like he'd opened it yesterday. My father had been dead 6 weeks. Before I tell you what was inside that safe, and what it did to the people who called me useless, let me take you back to the morning the phone rang. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel for everyone who got handed the dying thing, the hard thing, and got told it was all they deserved. We don't raise our voices here. We keep our receipts. Pull up a chair, drop a comment with the town you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. My mother had a stroke in February. My father followed her in March, quietly, the way the last train leaves a small station. No whistle, just gone. I was scraping dried frosting off a sheet pan when the call came, because a month before that, I had lost my bakery. 11 years of Brennan's, gone, because my landlord tripled the rent and I did not own the ground my oven stood on. So when the phone rang at 6 in the morning, my hands were already raw, and Travis was at the bathroom sink with a razor against his jaw. I told him my father was gone. He set the razor down. Then he asked me the first thing that came into his head. Did your dad get the apartments retitled yet? I looked at him for a long moment. They're not even buried, Travis. I'm just saying. Somebody should think about it. My hands were steady on the counter, and that was the first thing that scared me. That I could stand there and not shake while the man I married did math over my parents' bodies. Travis sold financing at a car dealership. He closed deals for a living, and he closed people the same way. You're useless with this stuff, Nora, he said gently, wiping foam off his chin. Let me handle the numbers. A month earlier, I might have nodded. But I had just watched a landlord I trusted hand my life's work to a vape shop, and I had learned something about numbers and the men who promised to handle them. I didn't answer. I put the sheet pan in the sink. And somewhere behind my ribs, a question started turning that wouldn't stop for weeks. What, exactly, had my father spent his quiet years building out at that dying motel? The will was read in the office of Lyle Garrett, upstairs from a shuttered drugstore with a swamp cooler rattling in the window. Whitney took the good leather chair. She wore cashmere the color of oatmeal and held a Starbucks cup like a piece of identification. My sister grieved the way some women shop, visibly, and for an audience. To our daughter Whitney Brennan, Garrett read, we leave the 3 residential buildings known as the Mesa Verde Lofts in the Sawmill District, furnished, all leases to transfer. Whitney exhaled. It almost sounded like a laugh. To our daughter Nora Brennan, we leave the Sundowner Motor Court on Old Route 66, including all adjacent land of record, all outbuildings and all contents therein. And the balance of our real property of record not otherwise devised, the outlying parcels wherever they lie, we leave to our daughter Nora as well. Whitney pressed a tissue to the corner of one dry eye. A motel. For Nora. That's so, Dad. Garrett cleared his throat and looked at me, not at her. There's one more item. Your father left a sealed letter addressed to Nora, to be given to her whenever she was ready. Not before. Whitney's tissue stopped mid-dab. Her chin came up. A letter? For Nora. Why? Garrett didn't answer. He had been a lawyer in this town for 40 years, and he knew which questions were legal and which were just hungry. I caught the phrase and turned it over in my head. All land of record. I had run a small business long enough to know that lawyers don't waste words, and neither did my father. He had paid by the syllable his whole life. I folded the paper, slid the sealed envelope into my purse, and did not open it. Whitney watched me do it. For the first time in years, my sister looked at me like I might be holding something she couldn't see. Travis had a spreadsheet open before we got home. He couldn't help it. 3 buildings, 12 units, he said, scrolling. Call it 12 grand a month gross, 140 a year. They aren't ours, Travis, they're Whitney's. And the motel's a teardown. Scrap and dirt. 60 grand if the bank's been drinking. He set his phone down like a verdict. This is simple, Nora. You and Whitney swap, or she buys you out. You walk into that closing and you don't leave useless. I made coffee I didn't want. Dad wrote the will, Travis, not Whitney. Your dad wrote what Whitney talked him into. I know that family. He said it like he'd married into something mildly embarrassing. Then, mildly, almost to himself, he added, and we'll need to talk about the bridge financing. I turned. What bridge financing? Nothing. Something I set up. Don't worry about it. There is a particular tone a man uses when he has already finished a sentence without you. I had heard it from my landlord a month before he handed my lease to the vape shop, so I didn't let it go. I asked twice. He waved it off twice, smiling, and that smile was the second thing that scared me. That night I was hanging up his jacket and a folded envelope slid out of the inside pocket. I caught it before it hit the floor. The return address was a bank, and the line under it read, Home Equity Account. I stood there in the dark of the closet with it in my hand. I thought about opening it. Then I put it back exactly where it had been, the way you set down a hot pan, carefully, and remembering exactly where it burned you. A marriage going bad is a pot left on a back burner. You don't smell the scorch until the whole kitchen turns. It turned on a Friday. Travis came home a little drunk. Not much, but enough that the man who actually lived in his chest had room to say what the daytime Travis only practiced. Whitney called me, he said. She says you told her you'd think about the swap. Think about it. That's what I said. You don't get to think, Nora, not anymore. You lost the bakery. You're out of a job. And now your father hands you a pile of weeds while your sister gets income, and you stand there and say you'll think. I set Frankie's school sweater on the dresser. Our daughter was 13 and asleep down the hall. Lower your voice. He did. And that told me everything, because a man who can lower his voice on command was never out of control. He was rehearsing. You're useless, Nora, he said, almost softly. You always were. Then he said the thing he'd come home to say, the way another man might mention the weather on his way out. Don't come back until you've taken the apartments back. I did not cry, and I did not beg. I packed 2 suitcases, my bakery ledgers, my mother's turquoise ring, Frankie's weekend bag, and the sealed envelope from my father, still unopened, in the front pocket of my purse. I drove Frankie to Joanne's and kissed her forehead while she slept. I'm fixing something, baby, I whispered. I'll be back. She wasn't fooled. At 13 they never are. She was just being kind. Then I drove east out of the city onto Old Route 66, until my headlights caught a crooked neon sign at almost 10 o'clock at night. Sundowner. Half its letters dead, the rest glowing a stubborn turquoise against the dark. The Sundowner had 12 rooms and one opinion. Stay away. The office door stuck in the jam. The key on the estate ring was the original cut, worn smooth by 40 years of my father's hand. But the air inside was cold, not stale, and under the dust there was cedar and motor oil, and the cologne my father had worn since I was a girl. Recent. I stood with my hand on the wall and tried to understand what I was smelling. I walked the row to room 9, the one that faced an old cottonwood. The bed was made tight. A Louis L'Amour paperback lay open and face down on the nightstand, holding its place around page 80. My father's reading glasses sat on top of it, the lenses clean. He hadn't been here once. He had been here this month. Maybe this week. I lay down in my clothes and slept 4 hours. At 2 in the morning, I got up for water, and through the office window the desert was black, except for a soft glow spilling out from under the doors of rooms 5 through 8. Lights I had not turned on, in rooms I'd assumed were empty. I stood very still. Then I saw the front desk. Behind it, low on the wall, a pine panel had been fitted into the paneling so cleanly you'd miss it in daylight. Someone had oiled it. Not once. Regularly. The hinges moved without a sound when I pressed the edge. Behind the panel was a steel door set flush into the floor. A combination dial. My father had been dead 6 weeks, and the brass of that dial was bright from handling. I knelt in front of it in the dark, in my coat, and I did not have the number. I knelt there a long time. Whatever my father had been protecting, he had locked it where the person who looked hardest would have to earn it. At 7 the next morning, a woman let herself into the office with her own key and a caddy of cleaning supplies, the way she had every morning for years. She saw me and stopped cold, and her eyes filled. "Mr. Brennan said you'd come," she said, when it was time. Her name was Dolly Marquez. She had cleaned rooms at the Sundowner for 19 years, and my father had kept her on long after anyone would have called the place a business. "Dolly," I said, "the motel's dead." Dad told everyone it was dead. She shook her head slowly and pointed out the window. A production truck sat by room 6, and 2 people in lanyards were carrying coffee across the lot. "He kept 5 through 8 made up year-round," she said. "There's a crew. There's been a crew for 2 years." "What crew?" "He'll explain better than me." She handed me a ring of brass keys, worn warm, then a torn slip of paper, a phone number in my father's square engineer's hand. "Eddie Sandoval. Your dad said call him second. Open the safe first." "I don't have the combination." Dolly almost smiled through the tears. "He kept the combination where he kept everything that mattered to him." She nodded toward the nightstand in room 9, where my father's railroad pocket watch lay face up beside the reading glasses. "He worked the line 30 years before he bought this place, honey. The man measured the whole world in numbers nobody else thought to write down." She picked up her caddy and went to make the beds in rooms nobody believed had guests. I stood holding a dead man's keys, looking at a watch, with a soft turquoise light leaking under 4 doors, and I understood that the dying motel had been the costume. The question was what it was hiding. If you have ever been handed the part of the family nobody else wanted, the dying thing, the hard thing, and been told it was all you'd ever be good for, stay with me. I didn't know it yet, but my father had spent 20 quiet years turning the dying thing into the only honest thing our family owned. Like this video for every woman who got handed the crumbling motel. Now let me show you what was inside that safe. The woman in the lanyard knocked on the office door an hour later and introduced herself as Gail Foss, a location manager for an independent film shooting out of New Mexico. "I'm so sorry about your dad," she said. "He was good to us." She explained it plainly, the way I wished someone in my family ever had. Her production had leased rooms 5 through 8 year-round for 2 years, crew housing, and paid extra to use the neon lot and the Cottonwood as a location. $6,200 a month, she said, like clockwork. Your dad never missed, and we never missed. Then she set 2 folded checks on the counter. He never cashed the last 2, said he was saving them for whoever opened the office. I picked them up. $12,400, made out to N. Brennan. My father had written my name on money he refused to spend, 6 weeks before he died, in a place everyone in my family called worthless. I had spent a month believing I was the family loser, the one who let her business die. And here was a dead motel quietly clearing more in a month than I'd taken home some seasons at the bakery. "There's one more thing," Gail said, gathering her coffee. "The paperwork your father kept in that floor safe. He told me once. It's the important part. Not us. We're just the rent." She left to go shoot a sunrise. I stood there with 2 uncashed checks in my hand and a brass watch on the nightstand, and I finally understood what Dolly meant. I didn't need to ask anyone whether I was useful. I needed to open the safe. So I went and got the watch. The back of my father's railroad watch was engraved with a string of numbers I had seen my whole life and never read as anything but decoration. He had called it his start date, the day he and my mother married, the day he started counting everything that mattered. I knelt at the floor safe and turned the dial to it. The bolt drew back with a sound like a key finding its lock. The top shelf held cash, banded by year, neat as a teller's drawer. The film rent he hadn't needed to spend. Below that, a row of green accountant's ledgers, spines labeled in his square hand, 2006 through this year. And on the bottom shelf, a manila folder with one word printed on the tab. Nora. I did not grab it like a prize. I sat down on the cold concrete floor and put my hands flat on my knees until they stopped shaking. A woman who has been called useless that many times learns to rehearse being seen before she lets herself be seen, so I breathed. Then I lifted the folder out, and the top document stopped me. It was thick, stamped, recorded with the county. The heading ran in capital letters across the top of the page. Ground lease, Mesa Verde Lofts, my sister's towers. The buildings the will had handed Whitney like the prize of the family, the buildings Travis had thrown me out of my own house to chase. My father had kept the paperwork for them, locked in a safe at a motel everyone called dead. I read the first pages twice. The words were English. Fee simple, lessor, unsubordinated, reversion. But strung together they guarded their meaning like a lock I didn't have the combination for. I'd run a bakery, not a title office, so I did the smart thing instead of the fast one and closed the folder. Whatever this was, I wanted Eddie Sandoval across a table when I learned it, and I wanted my own attorney before I said a word to anyone whose last name was mine. The text started before noon. You're being childish. Then, an hour later, Frankie's asking for you. Then, Whitney's worried about you. Then, near 3. I've been patient, Nora. I set the phone face down on the counter. I have learned that when a man tells you he's been patient, he usually means the opposite, and it almost always lands within a day or two of the moment he loses something he thought he already owned. I drove into the city that afternoon to see my daughter, the 40 minutes of high desert flattening out into stoplights. Frankie was at Joanne's kitchen table with a glass of milk and a worksheet. Dad says you're resting, she said, watching my face. I was, I said. I'm better now. I didn't say a word against her father. I just let her see me steady. That is its own kind of message to a 13-year-old girl. Joanne wiped down her diner counter and waited until Frankie went to do her homework. You should know, she said, not looking up. Travis has been in here twice this month, with that developer, Brant Coyle. Coyle. They sat in the back booth and used words like bridge loan and closing. Travis kept saying we, like there was a we. I felt the envelope in my purse, the one that said home equity, and the folder back at the motel that said Mesa Verde. 2 facts looking for a thread between them. Did Whitney ever come in with them? Once. She paid. Joanne finally looked at me. Nora, whatever this is, don't go in soft. You go in like the woman who used to run payroll for a bakery and never bounced a check. I don't plan to go in soft, I said. I plan to go in informed. That night, after the diner closed, Joanne poured 2 coffees without asking whether I wanted one. She divorced her husband back in 2017 when he gave her a reason to, and she'd spent the years since learning accounting at night and learning exactly how long her own silence was worth. I told her all of it. The safe, the film rent, the 2 uncashed checks, the ground lease with my sister's towers printed across the top. She didn't gasp. She just topped off my cup and asked me the one question nobody had asked me in 19 years. What do you want, Nora? I opened my mouth. I closed it. My husband asked me what was for dinner. My daughter asked me to find things. My sister asked me to make her comfortable. It took me a full minute. I want to stop asking permission to be in my own life, I said. Joanne tapped her mug against mine. That's a list of 1? Good list. I thought about my father then, the way he'd say things sideways, with a pencil instead of a sentence. He used to walk the rail line as a young man, checking the ground under the track for soft spots, and he had a line he repeated until it bored us. Own the ground you stand on. I'd thought it was about railroads. Sitting in that closed diner with a folder I hadn't finished reading, I started to wonder if my father had ever once in his life said a thing he didn't mean 2 ways. Joanne wrote a name on a napkin and slid it over. Sylvia Otero, Real Estate and Estates. She's the one you call before you say a single word to Whitney. I folded the napkin into my pocket, next to the slip with Eddie's number. Eddie Sandoval arrived at the motel the next morning in a Ford pickup that had been red when Reagan was president, with 2 coffees balanced on the dash and a face that had read 1,000 title reports. He'd worked escrow and title for 35 years before he retired, and he'd owed my father since long before that. He spread a parcel map across the office counter like a man laying out a meal he'd cooked many times. "How much did your dad tell you about the lofts?" he asked. "None of it." "All right. Then we start with the dirt." He tapped a rectangle on the map, in the sawmill district. "In 2006, your father bought this parcel when it was a gravel yard and a tire pile. Paid cash, held it." He moved his finger. "In 2016, a developer named Brant Coyle wanted to put up apartments here, but he didn't want to spend his money buying land. So he came to your dad, and they signed a ground lease. 30 years. A ground lease? It means Coyle's people built the buildings and own the buildings, but your father kept the land. The dirt underneath. In most setups like this, the landowner owns the ground, the developer owns what's bolted to it, and the developer pays the landowner rent for the privilege." He let that sit. "Your folks collected that rent quietly for years. Nobody in your family ever read the lease, because the buildings looked like the prize, and the dirt looked like nothing. So the lofts Whitney inherited are the buildings, the leasehold." Eddie picked up his coffee. "We'll get to what your sister actually owns, Nora. And, more to the point, what she doesn't." He set the cup down without drinking. "But you should sit down for the rest of it." We moved to a back booth at Joanne's, where the light was better, and Eddie laid 3 documents on the table side by side. The first was a recorded deed with my name on it, passed through the will, the fee simple title to the land under all 3 Mesa Verde buildings. "This is yours," Eddie said, "recorded, clean." The second was the ground lease itself. He turned it to the clauses he'd flagged with sticky tabs. "2 things matter here. First, there's a rent reset. Every 10 years the ground rent readjusts to current market value. They signed in 2016. The reset hits this year." He moved his finger down. "Your dad was charging them about $3,000 a month. A 2016 number. The market for that dirt has roughly tripled. A reset could put the new ground rent somewhere near $9,500 a month. That changes everything for the buildings." "It can. If the rent triples, those buildings may stop making money the moment the new number takes effect." He tapped the third tab. "Second, there's a reversion clause, and the lease is unsubordinated, which, in plain terms, means the developer's lender can't reach your land if the buildings default. Your dad set it up so the dirt was protected no matter what happened up top." Then Eddie slid the third item across, the sealed envelope, which Dolly had told him I was carrying. "I think it's time," he said. So I opened my father's letter at last, with a butter knife, because a woman who has waited 6 weeks does not tear. His handwriting leaned right, even and small. "Nora, I gave Whitney the part that shines. I gave you the part that holds. Don't sell in a hurry. Don't sell to your husband. The land will outlast all of it. Own the ground you stand on. Dad." I read it twice. Then I set it down beside the deed with my name on it, and the 2 pages looked, finally, like the same sentence. Eddie went home, and I stayed in the booth with my father's ledgers, reading the way I used to read my own bakery books at midnight. Year after year he had charged the lofts the same fair rent, never once raising it to squeeze them, even when he could have. The man owned the ground my sister was standing on, and he'd never used it as a club. I sat with that for a while. I could let the reset hit and watch the buildings drown. It would be legal. It would even be just, after the kitchen table and the door. But my father hadn't built a weapon. He'd built a foundation, and there is a difference. So I made my decision the way he would have. Slowly, on paper. I would use the land as leverage, not as a knife. I called the number on Joanne's napkin. Sylvia Otero had a voice like a woman who had told confident men no for 30 years and kept her kindness anyway. I told her about the deed, the lease, the reset, the reversion. I told her my husband had a home equity envelope he didn't want me to read. Before you do anything, I said, I want a full title search on all 3 buildings, and I want to know about any escrow that's already open. I want to see what's already in motion before I touch a thing. She was quiet a moment. Then she called me back that same afternoon, and her voice had changed. Nora, there's an open escrow. Your sister has the Mesa Verde lofts under contract to sell. The buyer is a development LLC, Coils. They're set to close in 19 days. She paused. And to close clean, they'll need an estoppel certificate signed by the landowner. Who's the landowner of record? I asked, already knowing. You are, she said, and they have no idea. Travis came out to the motel 2 days later. I opened the wooden office door but left the screen latched between us. The latch was cheap tin and wouldn't have stopped a determined man. It wasn't for him. It was for me. Nora, he said. I overreacted Friday, I did. I was stressed. All right? Come home. We'll figure this out together. I waited because I had learned to wait for the 3rd sentence. It came right on time. But we should talk about a fair arrangement because legally... There it was. Apologies that arrive with a second ask attached are not apologies. They're invoices, and the tell is almost always the word but, landing somewhere around the 3rd breath. Talk to Sylvia Otero, I said. My attorney. His jaw did the small, tight thing I'd spent 19 years learning to read. You got a lawyer? I got several things. He looked past me into the office, scanning, appraising, the way he looked at a trade-in. Then he said the thing that told me everything. Whitney needs this sale to close, Nora. We all do. There it was again. We. A man who'd thrown me out of my house was using the word we about my sister's apartment buildings, 2 days after I'd found a home equity envelope in his coat. I didn't let him see it land. Good night, Travis. I closed the wooden door gently and turned the deadbolt I'd installed myself that morning on my knees with a borrowed tool belt. The tumbler seated with a clean, final sound. Then I stood in the dark office a long time, fitting his we against the bridge loan against the closing in 19 days, until the shape of it came clear. My husband hadn't just chased my sister's buildings, he'd bet our house on them. Whitney drove out the next morning, which she never did without a reason. She wore cashmere and carried a Starbucks